Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is going to be an interesting topic today. We are going to move into the tax policy. So after the discussions on elasticity of demand, I think we are actually having a more in-depth understanding of the supply-demand model. We learn a little bit more about the shape of the supply curve and the shape of the demand curves and how it relates to its elasticity. So today we are going to put it into applications. So we would like to actually discover how the tax policy will affect the welfare of the markets. And obviously it has something to do with the elasticity of demand and elasticity of supply. Well, in this chapter, we are going to do videos on these topics. And if students have questions, obviously you can actually raise it in by emails or maybe send me a message to ask. But we're mainly going to focus on the economic logics of tax in this chapter. Well, just like any government interventions in the markets, tax policy it's a very, very common use policy to actually interfere the markets. And of course, the government is trying to achieve some of the goals. Sometimes maybe they want to discourage buyers to consume too much of the product in the market. Sometimes maybe because they want to provide incentive to increase the consumptions of certain things. But tax policy, it's just like any policy, it comes with a trade-off. Whenever a policy goes into the market, there will definitely be an impact on either side of the market, or maybe we study in chapter 1 or the principle of economics, there's always a trade-off between efficiency in the markets and equity in the markets. So a simple type of tax that we're going to study today is called the excise tax. The excise tax, it's basically a tax charged on each unit of the goods or service that it's sold in the market, and it's a fixed amount of tax. It's not like regular tax that we pay on the goods and services we buy in the market, because what we usually pay is the percentage of the value of the goods. So it's not fixed, depends on the value of the goods. But today we are going to basically use the simplest tax format, the excise tax, to just investigate the impact of tax policy. So later you can actually expand this study to what you do daily. All right, so we are going to begin with a very simple excise tax problem here. We are going to walk through the problem and see how the tax policy will affect the market outcomes. So suppose we are thinking about the government. They are trying to put a tax on the products, let's say on soda. And this is exactly what happened in California, right? Because we have this very special tax that we call the fat tax. Fat tax basically is a tax that actually goes on those high caloric content food products or beverages in the markets. So let's say we have a excise tax, 50 cents per cans of soda, and we would like to actually think about which side of the market, is it the supply side or the demand side of the market, will ultimately going to pay the price of this extra tax imposed to the market. So one thing very important to clarify here, there is a specific topics that you have to understand about the tax policy. Well, first of all, there is a placement of the tax. So the placement of the tax is determined by the government or the execution agency. The placement of the tax can either go on the seller or the buyers. So when the government actually mandates the seller has to pay the tax for selling each unit in the market, the seller will have to be the one making a transfer of this money to the government. If the tax is actually have a placement on the buyers, well, then the buyer will have to be responsible for making that particular transactions in the market for the tax payments. But soon you're going to see either one side of the tax or either one side of the market actually being placed of the tax. It's not going to make much difference. And particularly, you want to keep in mind, even though the tax pays on seller or buyers, it doesn't mean that, well, it's either the seller or the buyers actually responsible for the imposed tax in the market. So even though the government make a call that the firm has to pay that 50 cents per can of soda, it doesn't necessarily mean that the firm actually paying the tax for us. And more and so likely, you are going to expect the firm to shift some of this tax payments to the consumers. Now we are going to use a very simple supply-demand model to kind of investigate the case where the seller is being placed with this tax in the market. So now let's think about this graph. When the tax actually goes into the market, we want to know how it affects the firms because, well, we want to know, well, how is the supply going to be affected, because the seller now is the one who are responsible for paying the tax. Well, generally speaking, to be honest, most of the cases that you study in any economic textbook, tax policy only have an effect on the supply curve. Either the placement is on the firms or on the consumers. They will always be effective to the supply, just in an easy way to think about the problems. Well, the supply curve in the markets will shift up in this case because of the imposed tax in the markets. And the reasons for this upward shifting of the supply curve, it's pretty logical. Well, first of all, you think about the original supply curve, S1. So there is a set of prices that the firm is willing to sell the product at different quantity. And now, if you think about those prices that it's responsible in the graph, let's say, well, if we look at the quantity of 4 units, for the firm to sell 4 units total in the market, the firm originally needs to charge at least $1. And we have talked about the supply curve is the willingness to sell in the firm for the firm in the markets. So this willingness to sell basically represents the minimum cost that the firm needs to be retrieved from the market in order to produce 4 units. So it's kind of like a cost. So we're basically asking a question. If one day the government agency actually send a letter to the firm and let them know, hey, from now and on, every 1 unit that you sell in the markets, you have to pay extra 50 cents. Well, this 50 cents of tax, it's basically acting like an extra cost for the firm to produce the products. So that's why, as you can see, we are basically shifting the supply curve up by exactly 50 cents at every given quantity productions or the quantity that we actually demonstrate on the graph. Well, with the shift of the graph, now the thing is, well, we are landing on a new equilibrium. So the idea is, if we look at the previous equilibrium and compare it to the current after the policy, well, the new equilibrium, you will find out that there is a gap between the two equilibrium. And in this case, well, the gap between the two seems pretty obvious on the graph. So before the policy, we have the equilibrium in the markets equals to $1.25, $1.25. And after the shift of the supply curve by 50 cents, now the new equilibrium actually moved to $1.50. So in this case, well, you can simply imagine the total tax that it's being implemented in the market, it's 50 cents. And there is a 50 cents change in the market's equilibrium. So we want to actually put a little thoughts into this and try to think about what is the equilibrium price actually suggest to us in this model. So if you think about yourself as a consumer in this market, if there's any change in the equilibrium price of the markets. Basically, if you think about before the policy, how much you have to pay. Well, obviously, is the equilibrium before the policy, which is $1.25. And now, after the policy, the new equilibrium suggests an equilibrium price of $1.50. So obviously, that is the price that the consumer is going to pay in the market. So comparing to the previous price, $1.25, now you have to pay $1.50 after the policy implemented in the market. So that means the consumers is actually paying 25 cents more in this case. Ooh, there's a problem now. The total amount of tax that imposed to the market is 50 cents. Well, 25 cents is paid by the consumers. And we would like to raise the questions. Where is that other 25 cents left? Who paid for it? And in this case, hopefully it makes total sense to you guys now. Well, in this particular example, the total amount of tax, 50 cents per can, is split into two. Well, 25 cents are paid by the buyers, and now 25 cents are paid by the sellers. So that's why, well, in this case, the tax is equally or evenly split into the two sides of the market. Each side of the market responsible for half of the total cost of the tax. Now let's investigate what if the placement of the tax actually goes into the buyers. Well, this is only the durations from this textbook. Again, well, if you look at different textbooks with the micro foundations, most likely you are going to see the textbook explanations where the placement of the tax goes to seller or buyer will also affect the same to the supply curve. But in our textbook, we actually put this into a different way to analyze it. So when the buyers, it's the one who have to responsible for the tax. Well, you can imagine, basically you walk into a Safeway, you buying a can of Coca-Cola. It used to be $1, but now you have to pay 50 cents more because the government tell you so. Well, when the consumer is paying so much for the Coca-Cola or the soda, obviously the firm knows that people are going to buy extremely less in the market, and they don't want to get the sales drop too much. So what happened is, well, when the situation happens, the demand in the market will shift down by 50 cents. And again, logically, what happened is, if you think about the original demand curve, D1, let's say 4 units. Well, if you are going to buy 4 units in the market, the maximum price you're going to pay for each unit is $1.50. And we're asking a question. Well, after the tax policy, it's been implemented to the market. Well, what would be the price of tax of Coca-Cola that the buyer is willing to pay for the original price to get 4 units of Coca-Cola? Well, since now you are not paying just the price of the Coca-Cola, but the price of the Coca-Cola plus the 50 cents of tax. So the demand curve, the new demand curve, D2, basically represents, well, what would be the price before tax that the consumer is willing to pay. And in this case, obviously, it's $1 for 4 cans of Coca-Cola. Because, well, after the tax, they still have to pay exactly the same amount, $1.50. Well, with the shift of the demand curve, in this case, obviously, the market's equilibrium also shift. So we see the equilibrium actually shift from $1.25 to $1. Again, the $1 that we are seeing here, it's not the final price that you pay for the Coca-Cola. This is the price before tax. And that's why sometimes it could be confusing. Now, if we look at this example here, we know the total tax amount is going to be 50 cents. And now you are going to pay 25 cents more to get the same products. And partial of the tax will go to the seller. And in this example, we're actually seeing exactly the same results as previous. So 50 cents of the tax split into the half. Well, consumer pay 25 cents more, and the the producers are going to be responsible for another 25 cents, which adds up to be the total of 50 cents as tax. So either one way or the other, I would say, well, the result is going to be the same. So the placement of the tax is not the focus of our study here. The placement of the tax just basically explains to us, well, which side of the market is responsible to make the transactions of this tax money. But it has nothing to do with the payment of the tax. Well, how is the elasticity actually related to the tax policy? Well, in the previous example, obviously, we find the buyers and the sellers, they are basically sharing the tax in half. So do you think this is always going to be the case? Do you think there will be time where sellers may be paying more than the buyers? And buyers sometimes may be responsible for more of the tax payments than the sellers? Well, the answer is, it really depends on the elasticity of demand and elasticity of supply. The elasticity of demand and supply actually determines which side of the market will bear more of the tax burden, or which side of the market will actually be responsible for bigger portions of the payment of the tax. Well, let's take a look at the new example here. So in this second example, we are going to look at the market for gasoline. So let's suppose we assume that there is a little town in California, and this small town actually have maybe 20 people living in there, very small populations, and all these people needs to travel back to the bigger town to work. So that's why driving to them is essential. They cannot actually go to work without their car, and obviously gasoline becomes extremely essential to them too. Let's suppose, because this group of people do not have much choices, according to the previous chapter we studied, with no substitutions or very limited substitutions in the markets, well, the demand for the product will be extremely inelastic. So as you can see in the graph, well, the very steep sloping demand curve represents this very inelastic demand characteristics of this market. And we have a regular supply curve right here, which is an upward sloping one. Looks very normal. Now we are going to basically evaluate the effectiveness of the tax policy to this market. Let's suppose we are going to evaluate the policy effects to the markets. We first want to plot out the equilibriums in this particular market without any policy. And then we would like to actually shift this supply curve up by whatever the tax amount is. And in this case, we are basically imposing a $1 excise tax on gasoline. As you can see, well, this supply curve actually shifts up exactly by $1. And the next thing is, of course, to evaluate where the new equilibrium is. And we find this new equilibrium points, and we have the original equilibrium points. And now we would like to use the same methods to evaluate how much we are paying more in the markets after the policy implemented to the market, and how much is the leftover that the seller will have to pay for the rest of the payments of the tax. Well, particularly, we see that we have a bigger portions of the tax we have to pay in this case. Well, the supplier in this case only responsible for 25 cents out of the dollar tax, and the consumers actually responsible for 75 cents out of a dollar of the imposed tax. So now the question is, why? How come the consumer is willing to pay more in the markets, and the supplier can actually shift some of this tax costs to the consumers? So intuitively, it have something to do with the elasticity of demand. So when a problem like this actually put out in the public discussions, well, it's very likely that consumer will think about, hey, if I am going to see this tax posted on the product, do I have a choice? And in this case, if they don't have a choice, well, regardless how much the tax that they have to pay on gasoline, because, well, they have to ultimately drive a car out there to a bigger town to work, well, they have no choice. So when people are lacking of choices, well, they will become very inelastic demand to the of the products. And when people facing a very inelastic demand in the markets, well, they will tend to be still buy almost the same amounts, even though the prices actually increase a lot. And that is the reason why when consumers are not very responsive to the change of prices, the supplier will actually study the behavior of the consumers and trying to figure out, hey, should I actually shift some of this tax burden to the consumers? And in this case, it makes perfect sense because the consumers are not price sensitive. They don't care about the change of prices. They have to use it. They have to use gasoline. They have to drive a car. So it allows the supplier to shift some of this tax burden onto the consumers, which is demonstrated in the graph. Well, it seems like there are so many different scenarios that could happen now because, well, we could have some elasticity of demand that it's very inelastic and combined with a regular supply. But what if the supply is extremely inelastic also, like we talked about in the last chapter, when the firm actually launching the market in the market periods? Well, it will become extremely perfectly inelastic. So is there some way we can actually get a general idea about this topic here? Well, the rule of thumbs. Number one, we learned that the placement of the tax is very different from the payment of the tax. The placement of the tax does not determine who will pay more or less in the markets. The government is the one who determines the payment of the tax. The supply and demand actually determines who is going to pay the tax dollar. So the payment of the tax is determined by the supply and demand in the markets. Well, generally speaking, if we have a demand that's relatively inelastic to the supply, then the buyers will be responsible more of the tax payments in the markets comparing to the sellers. However, if the demand is relatively more elastic to the supplies, then the seller should take responsibility more for the payments of the tax than the buyers. So generally speaking, we know that the payment of the tax is not determined by the government. Whatever the government decides, it's not going to affect who is going to pay more or less. But ultimately, it's allowed the markets, the supply and demand, to determine who is going to pay for this additional amounts of tax imposed to the markets. Well, one more question about this elasticity of demand and tax policy. If the government objective is trying to maximize the tax revenue, let's suppose the government trying to impose a tax and they want to get as much or extract as much money as possible out of the markets. Well, you want to actually know whether the government should actually charge the tax with either an extremely inelastic demand or a more elastic demand. Let's suppose I plot two demand curves in the market. The demand curve for product B and the demand curve for product A. And as you can see, the demand curve for product B is perfectly inelastic. And the demand curve for product A is regularly elastic. So if we are trying to put a study here, we can basically ask the following questions. Let's suppose a new supply curve is being formed after the tax $1 is placed in this market. The demand will not shift, but in this case, the supply will shift up by $1. You want to find the new equilibrium for product A. Obviously, it's not too bad, because now we know that we are shifting from the original equilibrium, $2.50, 3.5 units, to a new equilibrium for product A, which is $3 and 3 units. If you're going to think about the equilibriums for product B, well, the new equilibrium will be always on that vertical lines of dB intersect with the supply curve. And in this case, obviously $3.50 and 3.5 units. So with this example, I want you guys to think about how much tax are going to be connected in these two cases. So first of all, you want to understand how to calculate the tax revenues from this graph. So the tax revenue, it's basically the total amount of tax per unit, in this case, which is $1, multiplied by the total number of transactions in the market, which is the equilibrium quantity in the market. So for product A, you can see that the tax amount is $1 always, and the total quantity in the markets being transacted is 3 units. So the total tax revenues in product A market will be $1 times 3, which is $3. Well, in the product B markets, the tax amount is the same, $1 per each unit. However, the new equilibrium suggests there are 3.5 units will be exchanged in the market. So in this case, the total revenues for the governments to connect from this market will be $3.50. Now, if you think about this number here and you are trying to ask the question, if the government objective is to maximize the tax revenue, should they actually tax a market that has more elastic demand or inelastic demand? Well, I'm not going to tell you the answer here, but I'm hoping that you can actually find out the answer yourself. So think about this example. Well, which one is more elastic? Which one is more inelastic? And which case actually give the government more revenues from the markets? Well, the last thing that I would like to remind you guys is, well, not only it's important to evaluate the payment of the tax in the markets, because it actually tells you which side of the market actually has more burden from the tax. But it's also keep in mind that we can always use the surplus analysis to evaluate the welfare of the market. Well, in this case, we are showing you a graph with 4 different areas. As you can see, well, we have the supply curve actually shift up already, and the gray line is basically the original supply curve, and the blue line is the new supply curve after the policy. Well, if you think about this policy here, after the shifts of the supply curve, because of the tax, we actually see the triangles green color to represent the total consumer surplus. The triangle in purple colors, which is the producer surplus in the market. Well, unfortunately, in the case of the original equilibriums, we should actually have more welfare to be captured. But we are still losing a partial of it. Well, first of all, the one that we're familiar with is the orange triangles. And in this case, the orange triangles in the graph represent the deadweight loss in the markets. Because obviously, the total transactions in the market is reduced because of the increase in prices. But we still have this empty rectangle area left in the middle that we do not understand what it is yet. Well, if you think a little bit more in depth, well, the height of this rectangle in the middle basically represent the total tax revenues per unit. So in this case, $35 to $50, which is $15 gap, basically represents the tax per unit is $15 per unit. And that is the how much the supply curve actually shift up. Now we would like to ask the questions. Hey, then what is the width of the rectangle? The width of the rectangle is 35 units, which is the new equilibrium quantity. So the government can only charge a tax based on the total number of transactions in the market. If there are 35 units to be exchanged in this market at the new equilibrium, and for each unit, the government will take away $15 from the markets. Well, then obviously this rectangle basically represents the total tax revenue to be collected by the governments. So this kind of graphical demonstrations is going to help you to see it visually, well, how the tax policy actually affects the welfare in the markets. Unlike in the previous case, when we study the price control policy, we know that the policy sometimes might actually help the consumers, sometimes it might help the producers. Even though it's not guaranteed, but obviously, well, there is a chance that the producer or the consumers might actually get benefit from the price control policy. But in the tax policy, well, obviously you can see that both sides of the market will not get any additional benefits by having a tax policy in the market. So both sides of the market actually lose. But what's important to note is, well, not only we have the debt weight loss lose in the society, but we have to also think about how governments actually using the tax money that they collected from the markets. For instance, you should actually ask the following questions. If the government's actually taxing so much on a product called cigarettes, so billions of dollars actually goes into the pockets of the government's agency. Well, how the government using the funding will become very crucial. Because, well, all this money or welfare from the markets actually goes to the government. If the government cannot do a good job to provide social welfare in our society, then obviously it's such a waste of the resources. And in this case, well, they should actually not even tax the market and return the money back to the people. Of course, there are a lot of arguments on how those public funding should be spent and how to actually keep track of the use of funding. But this is totally up to the government to take control. Usually people like us, the citizens, has very minimal power to actually affect the use of this money. But at least, well, next time when the government's proposing they want to actually put a tax on certain products, well, now you should actually arise the questions. Okay, well, partial of this money will goes to them. So what are they planning to use the money for? Well, by the end of the topics, there are some very interesting subjects that you can also find. So for instance, there is a sections that talk about the benefit principles of tax fairness. So basically the idea is refer to those who benefit from the public spending should bear the burden of tax, then pays for those spending. So particularly if you want to think about like public transportations, interstate highway system, national defense, those are the public services that we usually enjoy. And we would like to ask the question if those services is what being used by the public, and it's make it fair for the public to pay for it. So that's why when you're taking public transportations or BART, you usually have to pay a fee, even though it's a service provided by the government. Well, basically, this benefit principles of tax fairness, it's suggesting, well, the user of the public services should be the one who pay for the tax of that service. And also, there is another principle called ability to pay. So the ability to pay principle basically suggests according to which of those in the economy who has a greater ability to pay a tax, and they should pay more, so that, well, at least we can depends on the government to reallocate this funding to provide a more equal condition to the society. So most of the time, people, especially when people talking about like income inequality or lack of access to certain public services, the ability to pay principle, it's always brought up in the discussions. So for instance, like healthcare services, education services, well, those are the ones that always being brought up in this topic here. Who should pay for the tax? Even though people who are poor, they still need to use those services. So in order to provide those services to the general public, maybe we should actually tax more on the one that actually can pay or afford the tax, instead of charging everyone exactly the same rate, or maybe charged by the usage of the users. Well, again, well, whatever principles that we put out there, obviously there is no one rule that fit all. There will always be discussions on, for example, like which policy or which principle will be providing a more fair solution to the society. To be honest, if you are one of the millionaire or billionaire out there, and one day the government basically asks you, hey, because there are some poor people, they cannot afford to pay the tax, can you pay more? I don't think you will feel fair. You might actually be willing to contribute more voluntarily, but it's not necessarily true that people would be happy in that situations, right, to force to pay more. Well, the tax topic is actually a very interesting one. I hope you guys enjoy this video. There are a lot of new concepts that you learn in this chapter, and I'm hoping that you can actually take this opportunity to dive in depth to the supply and demand model so that you can have a better understanding about these topics. Again, I'm going to see you in the next video. Hope you are going to enjoy watching these videos and work hard on your assignments problems. I'll see you next time.